All right, we're live.
Okay, so let me start by welcoming everyone. I'm very excited about this panel and about having the honor to moderate this panel today. Just to get us kick-started, let me start by saying a few words about why we're organizing this panel in the first place. AI is set to deliver a lot of benefits, and we have a lot of talk about opportunities that AI will bring, not just for companies, for instance, or individuals, but also for society as a whole. There is also this whole movement of AI for good. So AI for social good, for common good. So really AI applications that are being developed by civil society organizations and government to benefit everyone. However, we do have this problem, and that is not an AI only problem, but it is a problem, that AI is not always inclusive, right? That sometimes there are groups that are left out. And most often those groups are already at a certain disadvantage in the first place. So it's typically not those who are already in a favorable position that suffer the most negative consequences of AI. Let me though stress again that this is not an AI only problem. Basically, we have inequalities and injustices in society, and technology, including AI, reflects these inequalities. So we need to pay careful attention to that when we develop and use these systems, but of course also within society as such, right? Just fixing the technology will not fix the society as such. So these two needs to go together. And that's why I'm very excited that for this panel, we brought different stakeholders together, public sector, private sector, civil society, and academia. So it's a very diverse panel. And it also looks a little bit different than your average AI panel. I just read today in the Politico newsletter that there is this idea of a sea of dudes or sea of white dudes problem with AI. So you will not have that problem with this panel. And let me start by introducing our stellar panel to you. Peggy Valke is our first panelist. She's a professor of law and technology at the KU Leuven, so a colleague of mine, and also vice dean of research at the Faculty of Law. She's a co-director of CITIP. She's an executive committee member of Leuven AI and a principal investigator in the Security and Privacy Department of IMEC. She researches a lot of interesting issues related to the rise of AI, algorithmic decision-making more generally in law enforcement, transport, media, a lot of different domains. She's a co-director of the Expert Center on Data and Society. She contributes to the Flemish Action Plan on AI. And last but not least, she also serves as vice chair of the CAHAI, which is the Council of Europe Ad Hoc Committee on AI. Our second panelist, Cathy Fuku, is a research consultant at SMALS since 2018, where she specializes in AI techniques, including machine learning and natural language processing. And basically, she deals with the introduction of these technologies in the public sector. And before she joined SMALS, Cathy worked on the implementation of laboratory computer systems in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry and got a master in cognitive science from the University of Edinburgh. So really interesting background. And just for those who don't know, SMALS is basically an entity who deals with a lot of the IT tools for the government applications in Belgium. So a very important player in Belgium when it comes to AI in the public sector. Then our third panelist that I'm pleased to introduce is Fanny Faniasukulu. Fanny obtained a master's degree in law, and then she joined B12 Consulting as a legal expert. She mainly focuses on the analysis of legal issues related to AI, and she developed a workshop aimed at equipping AI technicians on these issues. So really translating basically the legal issues to the technical side. She also participated in the construction of the MOOC Sustainable AI in Business by Agoria, which explores the link between the GDPR and AI. And by the way, I can really recommend that MOOC. It's free and it's really helpful. Then our last panelist, Nele Roekens, is legal officer at UNIA, also known as the Interfederal Center for Equal Opportunities and Opposition to Racism. She focuses on the discriminatory effects of the use of AI with special attention to the labor market and HR. Now, UNIA is part of Equinet, and the European Network of Equality Bodies and National Human Rights Institutions. And she alternates members to this core group on AI. She also helped preparing UNEA's submission to the public consultation on the European Commission's white paper on AI. And she provided input on Equinet's report on AI regulation for equal AI. And she also served as an expert in the Knowledge Center for Legal, Ethical, and Societal Aspects of AI and Data-Driven Applications. So I think it's fair to say we have a super talented panel today with a lot of different backgrounds. Maybe just a very brief word about myself too, before I forget. So I'm Nathalie Smuha. I'm the moderator and organizer of this panel today. I'm a researcher at the Leuven Faculty of Law, where we, by the way, just launched a summer school on the law, ethics, and policy of AI for the first time. I'm also involved in the Council of Europe work on AI as an independent expert in the OECD, and with Interpol, I also give advice. And important to say, in this Belgian AI week, together with Jelle Hoedemakers from Agoria, I'm leading the AI for Belgium working group on ethics and law. And the next event right after our panel will be exactly about that, so stay tuned. Now, how will this go? The idea of this panel is to have a discussion, so I will ask questions to the panelists rather than having formal presentations. And then we will foresee enough time to pick up your questions that you can type in the Q&A. So for those of you following on YouTube, this is live streamed. There is a chat, so feel free at any time to post any questions that you have. You can also say to whom your question is addressed, and I will either take up your question during the discussion, or we will foresee sufficient time at the end to take on your questions. So with all of that said and done, I think we can start with our panel discussion. And the very first question that I want to ask, and I will ask Cathy maybe to answer first on that, is why is it important to talk about this issue of inclusivity and equity with AI? Because you know, there is so much discussion on gender balance and diversity and inclusivity, and sometimes it starts to feel like this ticking the box exercise that we need to do, right? Yeah, we need to be diverse because it's supposed to be like that, and this way people are happy about us. So it can become a bit of an empty vessel. So I just wanted to reiterate, you know, at the start of this panel, why is it important to have a discussion about this and to also implement it in practice? Cathy.
Yes, as you mentioned, I work in the public sector, and in the public sector, you have to deliver services, equal services to all citizens. So if you implement a system that has bias, then you fail to your mission, that is giving equal services to all citizens. And also we have noticed in the society generally and recently that there is a huge digital divide. And I think that with this crisis, we've seen the consequences of this digital divide. So if we come up with a new technology and we add it on this problem, then it's not just for the hype, it's a serious problem. We have to tackle this digital divide, and we also have to ensure that these new technologies that brings a lot will not also introduce extra biases or ethical problems.
Okay, thank you very much, Cathy. Indeed, it's an additional issue to the digital divide. I think you're very right in pointing that out. Nele, would you like to briefly answer that too?
Yes, thank you, Nathalie. And also, first of all, thank you for organizing this interesting panel and inviting us to the debate. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you as well for starting with this very relevant question. I can add to Katie that it's not only the mission of the government, but that these are also legal obligations. And we committed ourselves decennia ago to human rights law and the prohibition of non-discrimination. This can legally not remain an empty vessel.
Okay, indeed, legal obligations as well, as opposed to only ethical ones. I think that will be one of the points that we can discuss further on. So Peggy, would you like to intervene as well, please?
If I may, Nathalie, thank you so much indeed for organizing this. I would like to add two elements here You said, why is it important that we pay attention to this? I think I see two main reasons. The first being because of the huge impact that AI systems can have on society. You rightly said, well, we have still, despite the laws we've put in place, inequalities, unequal treatment in society. But that generates data, historic data, that is used now to train these algorithms. And these algorithms may even further reinforce the existing inequalities that we have in society. And the second reason why we need to pay attention to that is that often this is hidden. Yeah, we've heard stories in the press about Amazon's recruiting algorithm and about scientists that discovered these hidden inequalities. It's because they are hidden. It needs scientists, it needs digging into these systems in order to find that they actually reinforce inequalities. I refer to scientists like Joy Walamwini, Timnit Gebru. So thanks to them, Cathy O'Neill also, thanks to them and raising attention to this, we became aware that AI systems often not only cement these inequalities, further cement them, but even reinforce them. So this is why we really need to pay attention and turn it around and use AI systems and algorithms actually to discover these inequalities that are still taking place in society. So we should turn it into an opportunity.
Thank you, Pehi. And what I really like about your answer is that it's the perfect springplank, as we say in Dutch, for the next question that I would like to dive into, namely, what are now actually the causes of discrimination, of bias, of non-equity, non-inclusivity in AI? Because you mentioned indeed data, you mentioned a few of these elements, but I'd like to get a bit more concrete about how this manifests itself, because indeed often we're not even conscious about that fact, right? It can be intentional, but also often non-intentional. So maybe Fanny, I would like to start with you now. Can you give me some of the causes for why this risk exists when we talk about AI?
Thank you. As well as the others said it, I'm really pleased and honored to be able to share with you on this panel. So to answer to this question, I'm not going to repeat everything that was said previously, but I think that it's really important to underline the fact that what is happening within the context of AI has its roots outside AI, if I can say that. All the question, all the points, all the bias question and the discrimination question pre-exist to AI. And what is becoming of a necessity within AI is the spreading, is the huge consequences that it could have, as it was said previously. So the causes of discrimination, as they are set outside the context of AI, need to be understood and need to be taken as, how can I say that? I would say that if we take the example of social media or smartphones, those are wonderful technologies that we are all using. And the thing is that usually there is not an upstream reflection on the consequences that they can have. And we kind of forget that the technology and the reality of the society collide together and have impacts on each other. And here the discrimination existing outside the AI system needs to be understood inside it, inside this context. So I would say that we need to understand, in order to tackle down the causes and all the discrimination, that those two words are intrinsically connected in order to see it from the technological point of view also as well.
Thank you, Fanny. Indeed, I think it's very important to stress this mutual influencing that goes on between the technology that creates on the one hand, and then the society that, well, shapes the technology, but is shaped by the technology. Exactly. And perhaps, I'll ask the same question to the other panelists, because I think it's important that we dig into this and also feel free to give some examples of concrete instances where this happened. Maybe Nele, can I pass the floor to you?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I completely agree with Peggy and Fanny that with the problems regarding the training data and the collection of the training data. But before I dive further in that, I want to put your attention on a key concept in anti-discrimination law, more precisely the concept of indirect discrimination. The anti-discrimination law also prohibits indirect discrimination, and this kind of discrimination can occur when a seemingly neutral rule, decision, or practice disproportionately affects a protected group. And this may often be a side effect of AI systems. This is very subtle. And as Nathalie already said, AI can be on purpose discriminatory, like, for example, Facebook targeted advertising functions in the context of housing, of targeting clients that have shown interest for anti-Semitic content to sellers of objects glorifying World War II. But it is very important to underline that there is no intention required to establish an infringement on equality law. And Peggy earlier referred to the Amazon example. You might have heard of this recruiting program that was developed but that showed a bias against women. This was partly due to the training data that was based on historical data of the company, as men were overrepresented for technical roles, and the algorithm thought itself that men were more suited for this kind of jobs. But this example also illustrates another cause that I want to draw your attention on, and this is the use of proxy data. Personal data like gender or skin color may often be erased from the data set. Like, for example, gender could not be used in the training data as a variable in the Amazon case, but some data that is included in a training set may correlate with protected characteristics and are proxies for class membership, like gender, race, or religion. And if we then go back to this example, as gender is not included, other proxies like language, height, or even an educational institution that is for only female students may be a proxy for this protected criterion. This also often occurs in cases where zip codes are used as a proxy for color of skin or in national or ethnical origin. And another thing I want to discuss that is even more subtle is problems in the construction of the model or the algorithm that may lead to discrimination. I'm not a technician, so if I do not use the most accurate technical language, please do excuse me. And Katie, maybe you can comment on this one, but we also see that feature selection and how target variables and class labels are defined can also lead to discrimination. For example, if we take a look at a recruiting sector, suppose that a company wants an AI system to sort out job applicants to find good employees. The target variable will be a good employee, and a class label might be someone that works full-time. But some variables that seem neutral, like working full-time, may have a greater or lesser adverse impact on protected classes. And the label full-time working might have a greater adverse impact on women or persons with disabilities and could consequently constitute an unconscious indirect discrimination.
Okay, thank you, Nele. That's very interesting and brave for a lawyer to explain these technical bias causes. Let me move to Kathy. Maybe you want to complement or give some comments on it?
A lot has been said about it, about the data and also what you say, the design of the features and so on. But I also want to point out the accessibility of this AI application. It's for a particular public, it's for people that are digitally skilled, and they are the one that give feedbacks, they're the one that give information. So we get into something where these models are tuned for a particular group of persons. It's not only biased towards ethnicity, but it's really a divide between people that are digitally skilled and they get more and more advantages because the application of AI is everywhere now. And there are other people that are left behind in this story. And also, I want to point out something I've read in the book. Maybe you probably know this book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, about the biases in AI. The author demonstrates how these biases can even add up for a particular group of persons. So in the American system, there are AI models for law enforcement, allocating schools, and so on. And all these, the bias target always the same population. So this add up to the bias add up for one particular group. So it's something very serious that we should really tackle and take into account if we want to go to, there are a lot of initiatives about AI or promoting AI. It's the new revolution, it's the new industrial revolution, but we should really, really tackle these kind of problems.
Thank you, Kathy. Let me just do a quick check. Peggy, is there anything you'd like to add on this question as well?
Perhaps very briefly, what Kathy referred to the United States. I think we've had controversies also closer to home with the UK that meant to use an algorithm to decide which school graduating kids could go to, and or because of the controversy, this was abandoned. We've had examples from the Netherlands, and Algorithm Watch has actually made a very good report about what already exists in Europe in terms of automated decision-making systems and how these can go wrong. No, I think we talked about bias training data, and this can be both in the field of computer vision, where the fact that algorithms are trained mainly on a certain population of a certain race and gender, that the results for other populations are I mean, the accuracy is really bad. It can work with, or it works in the field of natural language processing, where we've seen examples that, to illustrate the first, so this was the reason why systems recognized female persons in white skirts as the nurses and men as the doctors. And we see the same with natural language processing. The term hero is always put in relation to men, male persons and not female. So we talked about bias training data. We talked also about bias design of the algorithm. So where actually, because of some biases on behalf of those developing the algorithms, the results might not be as we want, or not be in line with our values. And I think we also discussed the cause that even if you curate your data well, even if you design your algorithm well, things may still go wrong because of the context in which it's used and exposure. And I think maybe it's a bit of an exaggerated example here, but people may have heard about Microsoft's chatbot Tay that they experimented with, and that started as a very nice chatbot looking forward to communicate with the people, and because of manipulation by trolls, admittedly, turned into a very racist, fascist even bot if I remember correctly, a couple of hours. So if you use it in a context where the algorithm is then fed with new data that are not so well curated, then it can still produce undesirable results. So the data, the design, and the exposure or the context, the use are things to keep an eye on.
Okay, I think we managed to get quite some comprehensive answers on the causes, and indeed important to stress that the cause is not just in one area, right? There are many different causes that can contribute to this problem, and that is probably also what makes it difficult to tackle it, right? It's not just that you can say, oh, let's just focus on cleaning the data and then we're good. There's so many other areas that need to be looked into, including our own unconscious biases that we are not even aware of in the first place. So maybe let's take a step further. Of course, this problem we said is not only limited to AI, right? This problem of bias, discrimination, non-inclusivity is already part of our world. And as such, there are already legislative frameworks, but also guidelines, frameworks more generally, let's say, to try to deal with those issues. So maybe let me go to Fanny. Can you just share a little bit, in your view, what are the frameworks, the main frameworks that currently exist to protect against the risks? And at the same time, the question I'll also ask, and I mean, you can all already start thinking about it, what are the gaps, according to you, within those existing frameworks? So to which extent do they do their job, but do they also fall short to some extent?
So regarding the question of framework, I mean, I think it can be answered twofold. We have frameworks and guidelines, as you said, and we have, on the other hand, all the laws that are already existing. I'm just going to talk a little bit. I think that Nella will probably be more complete about this, but on the regard of law, what I wanted to highlight is that we tend to believe that, considering the fact that AI is a quite recent, if I can say that, issue. I mean, all the discrimination questions raised by AI are quite recent, that we do not have already tools to tackle down, I mean, from a legal point of view. But we do. And I mean, as I said, Nella will probably talk about it more comprehensively. But I think it's important already to look at what we already have, how we can dive into that and use it against all the discrimination that can be raised. That's what I wanted to say about the laws. But for the guidelines and the frameworks, as I'm a part of, let's say, the private sector, I have come into the knowledge that there exists a lot of initiatives that has been done by, for example, I'm thinking about one that the Trinity College in Dublin raised, that is the ethics canvas, that is quite based on the business model canvas, but is more focused on all the questions related to ethics, but also to discrimination. And those are little initiatives that have been taken quite all over the world. But the difficulty with those kind of initiatives is that you have to dig into Google and search and looking into those different thing that already exists, and then get familiar with it and use it within the company, for example. So I think that the awareness on the questions raised by AI, ethics in AI, and more specifically here, discrimination, is the real difficulty is to get hands on those kind of tool and to use it into the practice. And I also wanted to talk about the Altai, but I mean the tool that was developed by the group of experts that you were a part of, which is also a huge and fantastic tool that we kind of got our hand on in my company. But once again, the difficulty here is, okay, we have it, how are we going to use it and to make it a real action within the company? So I think that's a bit the limit of those kind of framework. And if I can add another little thing, is that it also requires that we are going to gather all the team. And when I say all the team, I'm of course not talking just about the data scientists and the developers. I'm talking about the lawyers. I'm talking about the HR manager. I'm talking about the whole team. And sometimes it's hard for companies, and as I'm saying, I'm just talking for the private sector, to be aware that we need everyone around the table to talk about these things. So there exist frameworks, but there is still, if I can say that, a gap between having the framework and implementing it into a concrete thing within the company or the society in general.
Yeah, thank you, Fanny. And I mean, you gave us already an overview, indeed, of some of the frameworks, and mostly, ethical or, let's say, non-binding frameworks. So let me move right to Nele, who probably also can give us more info on existing binding legal frameworks. And I mean, feel free also to point out where you think they fall short or where they do already do a good job at dealing with this problem.
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, I completely agree with what Fanny said about the proliferation of ethical guidelines, but the main problem is that they are non-binding and need to be operationalized. But regarding the law that is already applicable, we have, of course, EU equality law and national equality laws. both are applicable, but it's really hard to enforce them because of the nature of the technique of artificial intelligence. And then I'm talking about transparency issues, the lack of information, but also the difficult information, interpretation of the information. If you're not a technician, it's very hard to understand what is happening in some kind of automated decision making. And another problem is the lack of standards, like how accurate does a system need to be or robust. So if we take a look at the current existing law and we see what's really happening in the society, for example, a customer's loan is refused, in that case, the customer will not necessarily know whether it was an automated decision that made a decision and why a decision is taken. So in other words, if the AI application that made a decision disproportionately affects a protected group, and if one of the parties has no access to this information, this means that equality of arms might be difficult to be respected in the context of algorithmic decision making. So to sum it up, there is a lack of micro transparency and micro transparency. Micro occurs that when the person does not know that artificial intelligence was used, and micro, the fact that the customer does not know how algorithms based on certain input A produce a certain output B. But on the other hand, we also have already the existing data protection law that is a little bit more developed and goes beyond privacy protection. I think Peggy will definitely want to comment on that as well. And we have some interesting cases in that regard. For example, the Sirhi case in the Netherlands, where the Dutch court considered this legislation, which was a legal tool used by the government to combat fraud in areas such as benefits and taxes, that it violated Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the respect of privacy, because it failed to comply with fundamental data protection principles such as transparency and the data minimization principle. Unfortunately, the court did not find that discrimination was occurring, but it did conclude that the possibility of discrimination combined with an absence of transparency fortified its conclusion that Article 8 had been breached. We have other examples, but I don't think we have the time to really dive into them. But I think it's also interesting to underline the fact that the need for a new and more comprehensive regulatory framework has been widely acknowledged, and the European Union has been working on this legislative package. This year, the Commission is also supposed to propose a horizontal regulatory proposal on artificial intelligence. And then a last thing that I can draw your attention on is the national existing guide law. So all these EU equality law has been transposed in national member states, and our Swedish colleagues of the equality body, Swedish equality body, has been working on an assessment of national anti-discrimination law in order to check if the national anti-discrimination law already provides for sufficient protection, and this could be followed by other EU member states.
Okay, thank you very much, Nele, for this very complete answer, as usual. I think it's especially important indeed to stress that if you don't know that AI is being used, or if you don't know how the algorithm works, it's very difficult to exercise your right to redress, even if you have one. And I also very much like the fact that you pointed out that issues of discrimination cannot only be tackled through help of non-discrimination law, but it also, to some extent, privacy protection rules can have a role to play. And then we started to go already a little bit into what could be some conclusions in terms of solutions, right, to these problems. So let me go to Pehi. So same question, but maybe you could also already mention what are some of the concrete solutions to these problems? Because we've now heard the causes, we now heard the legislative framework. Feel free to add more gaps that you can see here. But what are also, according to you, some of the solutions that we can start working towards?
Okay, thank you, Nathalie. I was still in the mindset of the gaps rather than the solutions. You're right, a lot has been said that even though we do have certain anti-discrimination laws, data protection laws in place, that it's sometimes hard to enforce them because of the lack of transparency. I would like to add to that there's also case law in the sphere of good governance. So administrative law that actually obliges administrations relying on automated decision-making systems to provide an explanation about the results of the system. And this is case law from the Netherlands, clearly stating that there is no equality of arms if the one that is subject to the decision doesn't understand how the decision was or what the decision was based on. Now, in terms of gaps, I think that the existing laws that we have are not only, it's not only difficult to enforce them due to lack of transparency, but also because they may themselves have certain gaps. And there is indeed Article 22 of the GDPR on profiling, saying that no one should be subject to an automated decision that has legal effects. Well, there are plenty of other decisions taken, like the kinds of advertising that we get, the price that is charged to us if we buy something online, and there you can debate. I mean, is this a decision with legal effect? It's not at all clear whether Article 22 would apply to such a situation, or if there is clarity, it goes rather in the direction of it's not applicable in those circumstances. So there I see already scope for improvement. And also when it comes to anti-discrimination laws, I see two issues that may really urge us to reflect upon the current anti-discrimination laws, which start from the limited set of protected grounds. That's an important limitation. And that looks at is one of these protected grounds being violated here? Was there a discrimination on the basis of gender, race, religion? And those are protected grounds that we recognize for the moment. And what are those two challenges? First of all, it's proxy discrimination, which has been mentioned a couple of times already. So we're no longer discriminated on the basis of our race, on the basis of our gender, but because of the type of magazine that we read, because of the kind of websites that we like or messages that we like on Facebook. And so it's this affinity profiling, these proxies that they use to make groups and put us in a certain profile that challenges anti-discrimination law. I mean, it's not covered under one of the protected grounds, but doesn't mean that it's fair. And second challenge, I think, is intersectional discrimination. As far as I know, I've had a student in the research master last year who wrote about this topic and pointed to case law in the US, where courts dismissed the claim of Black women who felt that they were discriminated against at the workforce because the court found, well, their female employees are not discriminated against. And when it comes to race, we see no male Black employees, but the combination of being Black and woman was the trigger. And the same goes in Europe with the Paris case before the Court of Justice, where it was a matter of combination of age and sexuality. So two men who only entered into a civil partnership comparable to marriage after the age of 60, because they couldn't get married before because it wasn't recognized in the UK. And then all of a sudden, because they were older than 60, they were no longer entitled to kind of pension. So the combination of age and their sexuality was here the trigger for being discriminated against, but the court said, well, you haven't been discriminated against because of your age, nor because of your sexuality, so we can't do anything. I mean, it's not covered by the law. And this proxy discrimination issue and intersectional discrimination issue is putting, in my view, challenges on existing anti-discrimination law that we will have to reflect carefully about. I mean, some scholars have already suggested that let's not simply expand the list of protected grounds, but let's use a catch-all provision. But then, yeah, I think that's also open for debate, because are we not casting the net too wide then? I mean, those subject to the law still understand what they need to comply with. So it will trigger, or it's certainly something that legislators, policymakers, academics will need to look at.
So
and then we can do now the round about the solutions. Let me give a few minutes to think about it.
Indeed, because I think we have a bit of a pessimistic view even now, because we now talked, a lot of time on the issues, and for sure there are a lot of issues and we will not be able to solve them all in one. Thanks also, by the way, for giving an example of discrimination against men, just to make sure that, it's about the problem with all unjust discrimination, of course, not only against one gender. Then let me go to Kathy. If we talk about solutions, can you maybe give a bit of an indication of how you see technically what kind of solutions we can have? We now heard a lot proxy discrimination, for instance. Is there something that we can do about it, from a technical point of view when we develop the AI system, right? How can we take this into account? And then I'm gonna ask you a second question at the same time, because I see that in the chat, a few questions are also starting to come in. One of them is from Gilles concerning bias. Can we live with AI systems with 50% bias that exists today, or do we want a smaller percentage of bias? So I think that question could be matched with another question from Mosake. Do you privilege statistically equal distribution of outcomes based on race or gender, or to equality of outcome based on skills? And to me, those questions actually go into what do we mean with bias? Or what do we mean with equity? Because when we talk about concrete solutions, and I hope to the persons who asked this question that this can be an answer, how do you define equity? How do you define what is a fair decision? Because if we want to program the AI to tackle this problem, we also need to program a sort of definition of fairness. So I know this is quite a big and difficult question for you to tackle.
Yes, it's a difficult question because, as you said, technical. Those are not technical questions in the end, because it's like you said, we have to define what is equity, what is fair, what is all right. We can discuss it a lot of time, but then how do we translate it into numbers? And honestly, I do not have the right answer on this is the way to translate fairness into numbers. But there are tools that are already, there is a lot of research in that domain, and there are tools from IBM or open source tools that we started to investigate and to try to tackle bias in the data, in the model. But how good they are, and will they tackle also what Peggy mentioned, proxies or maybe intersectional bias? I don't know how they perform on that kind of bias. But also for the technical point, we also have to take it into account when we have to get the data, when we have to define which features we will use. We should make sure that we do it with a lot of people involved a lot of people from diverse backgrounds in the process. For example, I'm just making it up. If you want an algorithm for tax fraud, for example, you should even involve people that will be impacted, citizens that will be impacted, in my opinion, by this algorithm. You should involve data scientists, business people, just to be sure that you understand the context in which you're going to evolve, what the features mean, and to find out the bias. And afterwards, you also have to monitor it's not just something you put into production and that's it. No, you have to monitor this model. And imagine in the case of this tax fraud algorithm, or an algorithm that will decide if someone is eligible for some tax reduction, it might be adequate in some context, but then the economic change and it's no more accurate, or so you always have to monitor the system. But then, what are the KPIs you will define to check the bias? It's not just monitoring accuracy. Is it performing well? But it's also, do you see a change for particular groups in accuracy, for example? So well, I do not have the right answer on how to tackle the bias, but those are elements that we can use. And also, I want to come back to what Neil said about people not understanding also what the algorithm is doing. For most of our clients, I'm already asked to have developed a system. First thing I'm asked is explainability. So technically, something like deep learning will be problematic in our context because for decision algorithm, we want human in the loop and we want explainability of the model. So this is a rule, general rule. And also, I always take the time to explain how it works. It's not just this is the algorithm, those are the results, but to explain the technology behind that. It's very important for the people, and I can see that they do not, they trust a bit too much the machine. So it's very important to make them aware of the flows of what does these results mean. This is a general, this is data literacy. I think we also have to improve the data literacy of the people, the end user of this algorithm, how they can interpret. So those are elements that can be useful to tackle bias.
Okay, so I think that's very useful already. First of all, what's useful is to show that there's no easy answer to this question. And I think it's also very important that you stress that as much as we are trying to look for technical fixes, a lot of these things are not technical questions as such, right? If we talk about equity and bias and how do we define fairness, that is not a technical question as such. You then need to translate it into the technology, but you need a sort of policy answer, a normative answer first, and get agreement on what that answer should be. So in the meantime, I'm also trying to look a little bit at the questions in the chat. And Fanny, I have a question for you, since let's say you're representing a little bit the private sector here. One of the questions that we have here is, you know, to make sure that the solutions that we're discussing here, right, whether it's explainability models or technical fixes, or as we saw, filling the gaps in the legal framework, to have a practical impact, wouldn't it be more important, asks Niels, to convince AI companies that bias tools have a negative impact? So to make them understand that, you know, it's negative for them as well, so to say, to have biased AI systems. And we could also ask, is that always the case? Because, you know, for some social media platforms, for instance, a bias can actually also be a business model that brings in more money. So maybe question mark whether bias is always negative for companies, but would this be something to be stressed? And another question that I'll also ask you, so sorry for the double question, Fanny, is from Louis. We often look at this from a technical point of view, but how can we improve legal ethics sociology aspects in the private sector and initiatives? So how can we raise more awareness about these issues in the private sector? So I'm going to ask you these two questions. Sorry for combining them, but I would love to hear your view on that.
Thank you for the double question. I will start with the question of bias, you know, whether or not it is a good or a bad thing. Intrinsically, I think that we all agree on the fact that bias are not something good, that it's not something that we want, whether it is in public or the private sector. But what I came to realize as I'm working in a company is that the very notion of bias is distilling, if I can say that, a real reflection that maybe the companies didn't have before. And I'm not going to say that having bias makes something, I mean, that there is a beauty in the bias. That's maybe too much said. But what I'm saying is that we are currently sitting on the table and thinking of how we are going to define our own perspective on what we want the outcome to be in what we are producing, in what we are doing. And I think that in itself, being aware of tackle those issues down. And if we didn't, I don't know, I see that my connection is not stable, so I don't know if you hear me. Okay, right, sorry. So just to summarize on this, the bias in itself is not going to be, is something that really needs to be addressed. But the first step in addressing those biases is to be aware of them and to sit at the table. And what, for example, at Beethoven, what we're doing, what we're starting to do is that as soon as someone has just a little doubt on the outcome, on what could be the possible consequences of something that we are developing, we are kind of raising a flag and we sit down at the table and we discuss, okay, what is the problem? What is the issue? Is this something that we can do something about it? Because sometimes the technical aspects are not going to change anything, because the problem is the solution that is developed. I mean, if someone wants to develop something that are going, I mean, I don't know, an application that is going to filter all the women from something, whatever it could be. What you could imagine, everything you want from a law perspective, everything you want from a technical perspective, the problem is the solution that is proposed. So, you know, when we just sit and think of it, it's as I said, the starting point of tackling the bias. So no, it's not a good thing, but we can see it as an opportunity within the private sector. And I'm really sorry, I forgot the second question. If maybe you can just quickly remind me. I'm sorry.
Actually, I think you answered to a large extent the second question.
Okay, right.
On basically raising awareness, but it's a first step. But indeed, it's not enough, right? It's a wider societal problem. Nele, I have two questions that I will combine for you now, if that's okay. Also from the chat, two questions that are a bit similar. So Maarten asks, do you see a future where reducing bias is actually easier in an AI decision than in a human decision? Can the use of AI, in fact, reduce bias in society? And there's another question from someone whose name I don't see, but the question is, are we not asking too much sometimes from AI decisions, whereas we don't have the same questions when it comes to bias with human beings? So is this something that you could answer? I know it's not an easy question either, but it's true that what about the role that AI can play, you know, to tackle, in fact, this problem?
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question, and the answer is positive. AI could be used to tackle discrimination. For example, via positive discrimination, you can improve inclusion. I think there is an example from Unilever that has now 50% of its managers that are female, 50 male, and due to an algorithm that was used. So it can be used to reduce mismatches on the labor market, so the existing inequalities. But also very interesting is that it can be used by social inspectorates for data mining and matching for the identification of structural discrimination. And more technical, it can reduce the error, the margin of error in some decisions, or you can leave out some protected criteria. This can all improve, but it's really technical, and you have to take into account a lot of things to make sure that this actually improves it, because we have a lot of opposite studies that show that it can help or that it cannot help. So the answer is not yet clear-cut. And regarding the second question, if I recall correctly, it's whether we're too stringent for AI and more severe than in real life. Yeah, I would love to go back to what Peggy said earlier. I'm really grateful that you pointed out intersectional discrimination, because indeed, at the moment, current equality laws are not suited for this kind of discrimination. And when, for example, for women of color, or the ageism and sexism, etc. But I think it's very important that we take a closer look at our society and what we think we still acceptable now that we have a little bit more knowledge and the awareness that is raised in the field of AI. We can use this attention to improve the debate in our general society. What is how do we want to structure our society.
Yeah, thank you, Nele. And we're reaching the last minutes of our panel, so that's why I'm trying to combine. I know it flew by, and there's so many more interesting topics to discuss. So what I'll do, I'll combine a few more questions, especially to Kathy and Peggy, because I haven't heard you guys in the last round. Let me start with Peggy. One of the questions that was asked by Eric is, should citizens and users be involved in the definition of the criteria behind algorithms, right? Because we talk, what is equity, what is bias? Is it realistic to involve them if we say yes? And maybe you can combine that answer as well with, concrete solutions. And I will add the question of myself to that, because, okay, we are now an all-female panel. But of course, how can we also involve, or how should we rely on stakeholders that are not necessarily those negatively affected? So if we talk about, discrimination against women, how can we ensure that also men are in this discussion and are allies? Because of course, it's not that men have no role in discussions about discrimination against women. So how can we make sure that all citizens are involved in this discussion?
So to the question, is it necessary to involve them? Yes, because you rightly pointed out that we actually have two aspects to this discussion. One being, how do we translate legal requirements into technical metric systems? But also the second aspect is, okay, what are the requirements, the normative requirements that we want to set? And then for that you can use laws, but there is also the ethics beyond the law, so to speak, and the law sets certain requirements, but as a company, as a public organization, you can have your own norms and values that build further on the law. And so to a large extent, this whole discussion is about the world, the vision of the ideal society, the world that we have, an inclusive society. And yes, of course, that involves discussion with citizens. Now, I had noted a couple of so-called solutions, and an important one in my view is to put people with a technical background and with a legal ethical background around the table, and even more disciplines, as much as possible. But I'm referring to technical people on the one hand and lawyers on the other hand, because before we close, I really want to point out the excellent work that is done by colleagues in Oxford, Sandra Wachter, Bert Mittelstadt, and Chris Russell, on this very topic. How do you translate fairness in terms of legal ethical concepts into technical auditing systems, metrics for AI systems? And two recent papers titled "Why Fairness Cannot Be Automated, Bridging the Gap Between EU Non-Discrimination Law and AI," and a more recent one, "Bias Preservation in Machine Learning, the Legality of Fairness Metrics under EU Non-Discrimination Law." They are available on SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, for publicly accessible. So those interested in trying to understand how can we bridge the gap between law and technical metric systems, and they outline the different fairness metric systems used in data science and AI on the one hand, and then case law of the Court of Justice on the other hand. So please take a look. We have 2 minutes left. I can unfortunately not go into the details, but I warmly recommend that literature. And another solution, in my view, is let public organizations set the standard. They should play an exemplary role here, just like in a sector that I know well, in the media law sector. Public service organizations in Europe are now looking into recommendation systems that push media users towards content of general interest. So you can use algorithms for a good cause to bring people to news that is curated, rather than, and we all know the documentaries that have been on TV about Facebook, just make algorithms to capture our attention and lead us to what advertisers like. So indeed,
let me pick up on that, Peggy, because that actually, well, as I announced, we'll have the very final question now because our time is running out. And since you mentioned the exemplary role of the public, that brings me, of course, to Kathy. So you're working in the public sector, we could say, and you have the technical background. So, you know, in 1 minute or so, because that's all we have left, what do you feel that you need in order to help you bridge, you know, the whole normative discussion on fairness, on laws, on ethical norms to your concrete job, which is basically building AI that can help citizens? So I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to be very short on it.
Yes, it's very short. But just to come back to Peggy, to the question to Peggy, if we do not involve the citizen, we will not have adoption and trust. So to me, it's very important. And to come back to what I need practically in my job, I need kind of DPO, that someone, and it's one thing that Fanny mentioned, hands-on, what should we do? So we have discussed all this, we have guidelines, but how do we practically translate it in what we are doing? So we need some kind of auditing or advisory group. And also something we have not discussed is third-party solutions. Solutions from Google or Amazon. How do we audit it? How do we ensure that they are fair? This is also a difficult question, in my opinion.
So I really like that answer because it's, I think, a perfect closure to the panel, and especially introduction to the next event that we have in the Belgian AI Week. So before I go to that, let me just thank all these panelists, and no, they were not picked by an AI algorithm, Eric. I actually handpicked them for their amazing expertise. So thank you very much for the super interesting discussion, for your answers. I think, I hope people who listened in the audience have a bit of a better idea of the many causes, but also hopefully some solutions to tackle this issue. And actually the next event that will take place in 15 minutes, so at 3 o'clock sharp, is organized by AI for Belgium as well. And the idea there is that we take one of the frameworks that already exists, namely the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. These were developed by the high-level expert group set up by the European Commission. And what we will try to do is to translate those guidelines to 3 specific sectors, at least to start with, because we understood that these guidelines are horizontal, but the issues that come up in different sectors, such as health, such as HR, and like the public sector, are quite different. And so since Kathy said, you know, she needs something like a DPO or some concrete implementation of how to take this into account, we want to develop this tool. It will be a self-assessment tool, so it's not a miracle solution, but it can help to take some more concrete implementation steps in the public sector and other sectors of how to operationalize trustworthy AI and how to take into account issues of bias, accuracy of data, etc. So you're all very welcome to attend. I see that Jill was so kind to put the link in the chat for those who are interested to attend. And well, let me thank again my brilliant panelists. It was a real pleasure to discuss with you, even if our time was way too short. And I look forward to working with you in another capacity soon. Bye.
Thank you, Nathalie.